Hello and welcome to this episode of Civic Yarn, connecting stories from town meeting to the State House. I am your host, Olga Peters, and on this show, we share the stories of public office and what it means to serve our democracy and in turn, our community. Now, some of these stories, folks, will be funny. Some of them may be heartbreaking, and some of them may just prove that there is no place like Vermont. I want to welcome to this episode Robert Sand, who is the High Bailiff of Windsor County, and Windham County Sheriff Mark Anderson. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
So for folks who may not know Robert or Mark, Robert is a professor of law at the Vermont Law School. He also serves with the criminal law clinic at the school and is the founding director of the Center for Justice Reform. He has served as the state's attorney for Windsor County and has worked extensively on reforming drug laws and has helped co-found pretrial services programs and Vermont's DUI treatment court. For folks who don't know Mark Anderson, he started his career in law enforcement after taking a law enforcement class at the Windham Regional Career Center. He started as a part-time deputy and dispatcher in 2004 and rose through the ranks until in 2019, he was appointed as sheriff by Governor Scott to replace his predecessor, Sheriff Keith Clark. Mark is also an instructor and was the first deputy in Vermont to be trained as a drug recognition expert. Whew, no small feat, guys. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
I would love if we could start with you, Mark. And would you share with us the moment you decided to run for office? And I realize this is an interesting question for you because you were appointed, but you had to be interested in the job. And what was kind of that moment that you're like, yes, this is what I want to do?
So this will be one of the funny stories. Anybody who knows me knows that I have a sense of humor. And the one thing that people tell you is never go to your boss and tell them that you want their job. And so I jokingly told Sheriff Clark one day in his office, well, I wanted his job when he asked me what I wanted to do with my career. And he took it in stride and said, I'll tell you what, I'll teach you how to do the job if you agree not to run against me. And I said, deal. So that was probably about 10, maybe 12 years ago. And so I had the opportunity to see a lot of different facets of the department. And then I ran for High Bailiff in 2016, I believe, in Windham County to ultimately just be the next in line. It's the only office, or the sheriff is the only office in the state of Vermont where the second in command would not be the predecessor to the position. So it seemed to make sense as the second in command of the department that I also carry the legal status from the High Bailiff's position. So that was my first time running for office.
Wow. Now, just for clarity, it sounds like the High Bailiff would be the predecessor if for some reason the sheriff had to leave, or like why that choice?
Yeah, so the High Bailiff has two responsibilities. One is to fulfill the responsibilities of the sheriff in their absence or incapacitation. And the second is to serve, I believe it's process or writs that the sheriff's unable to serve, which is commonly construed to mean arrest the sheriff. So I, again, jokingly, I also told Keith that I was coming for him every day.
You really wanted his job. Now,
in a respectful way.
Now, in Vermont, the sheriff is the only elected law enforcement official, correct?
That's correct. And if we want to ignore the law enforcement role of a state's attorney or the attorney general.
Okay, thank you. So for you, Robert, what about your decision to run for High Bailiff?
I'm not sure that there was an aha moment. So I had run for countywide office 4 times previously as the state's attorney, served for 16 years, decided it was time for someone else to have as much fun and stress as I had as state's attorney, stepped down, went to the law school, and after a couple of years there, realized I missed public service, and so wanted to get back. I will confess that, and we can talk a little bit more about the role of high bailiff. Running for high bailiff was a little bit of a slightly whimsical move. It was also a desire to serve again, but also a desire perhaps to take an office that is enshrined within the Vermont Constitution, that historically does very, very little, and maybe see if it could blossom into a role that actually provided a service to the people of the respective counties.
And how did people react when you said, "Oh, I was going to run for high bailiff"? Did most of them say, "What the heck is that"?
I mean, no, really, it is a small universe of people who know what the high bailiff is or does, in part because Vermont is the only state in the union that has the role of high bailiff. As best I can tell, I think the Isle of Skye in Great Britain, or northern Scotland, may be the only other place that has a high bailiff. On top of that, when people hear the word bailiff, they think that means a court officer, and the high bailiff is not a court officer. And so, yes, there was a fair amount of what the heck is high bailiff and why are you running for it? I will confess, in my moments of more levity, I say it's a job that has no pay and no responsibility, and therefore I'm ideally suited for it. It is, on the other hand, a constitutional office, so I don't want to be totally flippant about it.
Mm-hmm. And for both of you, what is it about public service that you keep coming back to? Because it can be a thankless job. How about we start with you, Mark?
Sure. I come from a family of helpers, and so helping people has just come second nature. I can't say what brought me back to public service, because my entire adult life I've been involved in public service, whether through the Sheriff's Department or through the National Guard. I've always been involved in trying to help my community. And it's one of the things I'm passionate about, is making the place I want to live the same for others.
And how about you, Robert?
I really think that elected officials, in many respects, are educators. And I'm not sure they always fulfill that role. And so I've been was interested as state's attorney, and just am still interested as high bailiff, in how can the elected officials help their constituencies understand some complex systems. The law and the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system, is a language of its own. And people have very strongly held feelings and emotions about the criminal legal system. They're not always fully informed about its nuances and complexity. And so I've always been interested in how to bridge that gap between the complex and sometimes archaic language and process of the criminal legal system and the public's understanding, or sometimes misunderstanding, how to serve in a role that would better inform them.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you've come across around the legal system?
So I have to draw on my time as state's attorney to answer that. And that's what I think people forget, and this is not unique to Vermont, or never really appreciated, is that crimes are defined by statute. They're in our criminal code, and they have elements. And if those elements can't be proven, the crime can't be proven. And so the public will have a very strong reaction to an event and think there has to be a criminal consequence, but they don't filter that through the analysis of what does the law say. And honestly, the killing of George Floyd was a great example, because people immediately rush to a feeling about this must be this crime. And it isn't that crime unless and until there's proof of the specific elements.
Thank you. Mark, you must come up against a number of misconceptions, in part because not only, as Robert said, people don't necessarily understand the criminal system, but as a sheriff, some of what you do is different from what, say, a town police officer might do, or a municipal police officer. So can you highlight some of the moments in your career where you've had to kind of come up against that?
Sure. Well, there's many. I'm going to pick two. One's recent, and it came on the heels of George Floyd. There was a mural painted in the town of Putney that said Black Lives Matter. And shortly after, there were tire marks made across the Black Lives Matter. Now, we do have laws that govern how vehicles are operated on roads. We have laws about property and damage of property. And there's nuances to these laws where, while we can say with moral and ethical conviction that this is wrong, but if it doesn't satisfy the legal criteria as a law enforcement officer, I can't compel someone to court. I can't charge them with a crime. They can't be subject to a punishment under our current construct. And so that's where we go to the legislature saying, well, this is what happened and we have a problem. So that was actually part of an active discussion with our local county delegation to say, this is what happened and the laws don't quite suit it and here's why. While we work with the community towards rebuilding that dynamic and the relationship about trying to coincide and live in the same space together. The entirely away from a law enforcement context, the sheriff's office is probably the most curious formation of government in the state of Vermont. We are primarily not tax funded. A lot of people believe that we're funded through the county budget, and what's funded through the county budget is my building, the heat for my building, the telephone for my building, and 2 of my staff members. But everyone else is actually an employee of the sheriff. So through that, we run into an interesting dynamic of, well, I called the sheriff who's right down the street and they said they couldn't help. Well, the reason we can't help is because we provide a professionalized service that has to be funded to pay for things like cars and equipment and training. We want to make sure we have a highly trained professional workforce. So it becomes difficult to say, well, we want to do that, but it comes at a cost.
And thank you to both of you for those responses. That's really interesting. During your years of service, I'm wondering if there are moments for either of you or memories that stand out for you in your roles that you can share. Let's start with you, Robert.
Olga, so the honest answer, if I confine my response to High Bailiff, is no. As far as I can tell, in the history of the state of Vermont, the Windsor County High Bailiff has never had to do anything. And so I understand the role of the High Bailiff is to arrest the sheriff if a warrant is issued for the sheriff's arrest, to serve on an interim basis if the sheriff is incapacitated, and to serve writs that the sheriff is incompetent to serve.
Right.
We have to understand that historically, before 1940 something, we didn't have a state police. So probably the most powerful, for lack of a better word, law enforcement position was the county sheriff. There were municipal police departments, but the county sheriff had the broadest jurisdiction. So I think Vermonters back in, I've forgotten the exact year, decided we ought to have a position designated in case the sheriff transgresses to step in.
Fair enough.
Now we have state police. So if for whatever reason a sheriff got in hot water that necessitated an arrest, a very, very rare occurrence, honestly, there's no reason the high bailiff would have to do that. A member of the Vermont State Police could do that. So there really are not active roles for the high bailiff at present. Part of what I'm interested in doing is trying to get a statutory rewrite of the responsibilities to let the high bailiff be a liaison or an ombudsperson between the county criminal legal system and perhaps the legislature. And so there's some draft language floating around. Honestly, in my judgment, reflecting on something Sheriff Anderson said, I think the second in command should be the successor on an interim basis. Believe me, the people of Windsor County don't want me acting as sheriff. And so when I ran, I made my sheriff promise that he wasn't going to step down until his term was over. I do think there's a role for not civilian oversight, but for civilian input into the state of the county system. And that's what I hope to turn this position into. I could tell you 100 stories about life as state's attorney, but I think you're going to talk in a future episode to someone else who's state's attorney, so I won't.
We are, but before I move on to Mark, I would love to hear, because you did talk about one of the things you want to achieve is to help educate Vermonters on their own civic life. Do you have any moments or remember interactions with people about civics, about education?
Again, not really in this role. In many respects, I think, hearkening back to George Floyd, I made a video in my car, because it was the only place at the time I could get Wi-Fi, laying out the charges and the elements. And it's on the law school webpage someplace. I think a lot of people said that was really helpful because I just assumed that it was this, that, or the other crime. Mm-hmm. But Minnesota has some really idiosyncratic laws, and just breaking it down piece by piece, I think folks found quite helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. So for you, Mark, how about any moments that stand out in your years of service?
So I actually have to reflect as the high bailiff opportunity, because Windham County has had, in my career, two times where the high bailiff was actually used. One was back in roughly 2005 or 2006 when the sheriff was, or pled guilty, I believe, or at least no contest to criminal charges for embezzlement and some other things. Misuse of department funds, neglect of duty, I believe, were some of the charges. And so the high bailiff, as part of the plea agreement, the sheriff resigned and the high bailiff took over for, I believe, a total of 4 hours, at which similar circumstance, it was a doctor from Gray's Cottage Hospital who was the high bailiff, and he reached out to Dick Guthrie, who was the chief of police of Brattleboro, had been a lieutenant with the sheriff's office, had a long history in law enforcement, and said, I need you here to run the operation. So for about 4 hours, I believe, Dr. Backus served as high bailiff, or actively fulfilling the roles of the sheriff. And then Sheriff Guthrie was appointed by the governor then to fill out the remainder of the term. And then the second time in my knowledge was when I took over, and that was for 11 days when Sheriff Clark retired on July 1st of 2019. I stepped into that role, but I was also the second in command of the department. So through that, it worked the way that, as Mr. Sand has said, the second in command has a better understanding of how the organization works, what the ins and outs of the operational systems are, and it makes a lot more sense for that person to be operating the show. Now, because I was reflecting on that answer, I don't recall the original question. Would you mind repeating it?
Happy to. I was just wondering if any moments for you or interactions with folks when you're serving the public that stand out, that either remind you about why you do this job or even just have always stayed with you.
Many, more than I can share today. And it's a source of pride, both good and bad. Good and bad stories, which you can reflect on and look at it with a growth attitude and a growth mindset to say, either for the bad, how do we prevent that from happening? And what things can we implement, whether it's policies or procedures, or it's new systems and new approaches, new looks. To the good side, which is how do we embrace community building and how do we bring people together to say we're all in this together? How do we stay on this earth hurtling around the sun at a ridiculous speed and have peace while doing that? I recently wrote an article. Actually, it's been about a year. No, I don't know when it was. I wrote an article as a compassion piece as part of Compassion at Brattleboro. Which discussed one of my foundational bedrocks. I was a young deputy. I was transporting a man from a correctional facility to a healthcare facility for treatment. Mm-hmm. And there was a significant struggle and past attempts to bring him. Nobody could really understand why. It turned out that he was just embarrassed by being in the Department of Corrections clothing, being in restraints, going through a public place, being escorted by a deputy. And we worked to minimize all the concerns he had of perception. So we covered him with a blanket. We made him look like he was just another person in the hospital. I would dress in plain clothes. And we worked to help get him to a point of treatment, because whether his crimes warranted imprisonment under the judicial system, he still has the right to treatment. And we can't lock him up and throw away the key when we are saying by our society's standards that, hey, if he does these things, it helps rebuild and rehabilitate him to reintegrate with our society. So we have to have some compassion to treat these people. That's one, but one of many stories. Had the benefit of working with a variety of people who I didn't have the opportunity to work with immediately after George Floyd's killing. And originally, people would say, how are you doing? And it's like, I'm actually doing really good, because I'm having conversations with people that we didn't get to have these conversations before. Now we're actually working towards change, and we're working on modernization of policing. We're working on accountability. We are working on things. And Vermont's very fortunate in that we have accomplished so many things towards professionalism in policing. There have been stories about police officers in Vermont getting arrested. And I had a conversation with someone who said, well, that's a bad thing. I said, that means that accountability is happening. We are arresting police officers at the same time as arresting other people committing similar crimes. You don't hear about that in other places in the world. So the fact that you hear about it, that's a sign that we actually have accountability that's occurring. Is there places to improve? Of course. And we are continuing that work, but I could go on for hours.
And are there features or aspects of your position that you wish Vermonters understood better and would perhaps help them understand their own democracy better?
Sure. So I think starting off with how we are funded as an organization, I have two responsibilities under Vermont law. And those responsibilities is for me to serve what we call civil process. Those are documents issued by the civil court. It could be that you're being sued in a civil matter. It could be that you're being your vehicles being repossessed for failing to pay for things or pay the bill. A variety of things come out of civil process. It could be divorce. So we are the mechanism that provides the service of those documents. And then the second thing I'm responsible for as sheriff is the transport of prisoners from the Department of Corrections to the judicial or to the courthouse. Those are my statutory responsibilities as sheriff.
Wow.
It's not what people see. What they see is a marked car with blue lights on it, and they're doing law enforcement. The law enforcement piece, which represents, in my county's case, 25% of what we do, financially what we do, but that's the most visible. We work with various government bodies to help with safety planning. We provide transports because we have deputies trained heavily in secure transport of people who are harming themselves that aren't in criminal custody. So we have strategies, and part of the idea is that you don't know that we're involved in that, not because of secrecy from our part, but because a person with a mental illness that's incredibly violent, well, we want them to get treated. An ambulance would be an ideal way to transport them, except for the fact they're incredibly violent, and ambulances are incredibly dangerous with violent people. So we have people trained to recognize that mental illness is not a crime. It is something that we need to recognize and provide the medical and mental health resources to. And we have people trained to understand the difference from a criminal transport and a mental health transport, where they are treated. I mean, we treat everyone with compassion, but we have different procedures and criteria to ensure that a patient's rights aren't offended where they exist.
Thank you. So, Robert, I know you've touched on a few things about the high bailiff, but I just want to see, is there anything you'd like to add?
I guess I would just say that the probably founding fathers in Vermont, but historically, some people thought there was value in having this independent actor within the county system. And it's an underutilized position. It doesn't have a lot of responsibility. So I'd like to do an extrapolation and say, back then, pre-state police, Vermonters thought it was valuable to have this independent actor in an instance when the sheriff could no longer act. So that was this independent role vis-a-vis the criminal legal system. Well, let's bring that into this century and say, what could an independent person do now? Because one of the things that we don't do a really good job of in Vermont is appreciating that we don't have a criminal justice system. We have multiple systems, plural. 14 counties, each one of them operates differently, each one with an elected prosecutor who brings their particular philosophy and bias and perspective to bear. The legislature doesn't really have a great way to collate and analyze those differences. So my broader vision of the high bailiff is that we would get charged by the legislature to create a report about each county, which then gets collated and collected and shared in Montpelier, so they can see, when you cross from Windsor County into Windham, these differences are taking place. Or you go from Windham with, let's say, utilizing non-court-based resolutions at a pretty high level over to Bennington, and they're not using community-based outcomes to the same extent. Why is that? So I think the high bailiff could help us appreciate the county-based differences, which might in turn lead to a somewhat more uniform system.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. What's the hardest thing about your roles? Let's start with Robert. Is he smiling?
And I really, they're, under the current statutory scheme, there is nothing for the high bailiff to do but be on standby. That just is not their role. I think a high bailiff could seek to educate him or herself about the role of sheriff. Could, I don't know, maybe go through some training at the police academy, but essentially it is a role that is just stand by, and if you're ever needed, we'll let you know. So I've actually forgotten your question as I'm rambling, but there's just isn't a whole heck of a lot to do as high bailiff unless and until there is some bad outcome for a sheriff.
And I'm curious, do you have a sense, or do you feel even that the high bailiffs across the state for each county, do you feel they're even connected, or are they all out kind of on their own, like you said, on standby? I mean, do you have like a club? Do you have a club of high bailiffs?
We talked about having a club and a secret handshake, but we didn't. No, we really. So I had been in touch with John Hagan a little bit, and a high bailiff in another county, and we talked about coming together. For a short while, there was a legislator who was interested in maybe doing some of the statutory restructuring to create some new roles and responsibilities. And I suspect when the next session starts up again in January, if that gains some traction, the high bailiffs will come together more to talk not so much about how to do the current job, but really what kind of restructuring, statutory restructuring, would make sense to turn this into a more meaningful position.
Thank you. Mark, how about you? What's the hardest part about your job?
Accessing resources. In fact, the pandemic was an excellent example of it. County governments in Vermont are minuscule. It is the elected officials of the county government is the sheriff, 2 assistant judges, and the high bailiff. There's a county treasurer, there's a county clerk, and well, we've discussed pretty much county government. And so during the pandemic, the sheriffs are treated as neither fish nor fowl. Often we will be told we can go to the county to receive funds, and the county will tell us to go to the state to receive funds. As a elected official, granted I'm appointed and fulfilling that role, as an elected official, the sheriff is paid by the state of Vermont, not by the county. And there's this weird divergence of money that is paid by the state to support the sheriff's office to fulfill the state responsibilities of the sheriff, the 2 I shared earlier. And then we have this other portion of what we do, which we call our contract business. And that's where we contract with towns to provide law enforcement services. That's where we contract with the state to provide a variety of support, such as the security at the DCF buildings when the DCF workers were murdered up in Washington County. So the irony is that the contract portion of what I do is actually the majority of the work that I do. But because that is a contract business, and it is truly a business, it's not seen because it's not voted on. It's not in a budget anywhere. It's what comes in and what goes out. So through the pandemic, because almost all of the contract business was halted, we didn't have construction jobs. We didn't have people being transported from facilities. We didn't have a variety of civil process being served. We found that we had the same number of staff, which we knew that we needed, but we didn't have any income or revenue. And so when we said the county can't pay for this because the statute's specific that the contracts have to support themselves, but this makes no sense. Well, we were told we're not eligible. When we applied for payroll protection plans, we were told we're not eligible because we're a qualified government entity, and because we have technically we have taxable abilities, it's not an issue. But the law doesn't provide the assistant judges the ability to pay for our staff, except for the 2 administrative staff. So it became this very difficult problem where we're not qualified for the things that make the most sense of what we do, which generally speaking, the private sector fits more in line with what we do. And that's kind of a bizarre relationship in the dynamic of the criminal justice system itself. But when we go to state government, we're told, well, that's not a priority for us, which is, it's been characterized with the ARPA funding that was set aside for the county government, which was wholly oversized for Vermont. I mean, there's no way we needed $320 million, but we did need something. There came a point where I almost had to shut down my regional dispatch because we just don't have the income.
Wow. And what do you think is the way forward with that? Like, have you sat down and had conversations with lawmakers or?
Absolutely. So I've spoken with lawmakers, spoken with other sheriffs, spoken with members of the community, spoken with high bailiffs. The county government, it's a throwback. Many of the laws are archaic. Many of Vermont laws are archaic. They need to be updated in many ways, and there's not enough resources in the state to do that necessarily. But with the progression of modernization of policing, this is really part of the active conversation. How do we fix the problems we've talked about for 50 to 70 years? I operate a regional dispatch because we recognize that that's a best practice. Why can't I get funding to do that through a tax service? We are providing a service that people want and need. Why is that based on a private contract and market forces? That doesn't make sense. And public safety should not be tied to market forces. It should be tied to social safety nets.
So I'm going to diverge a little bit from some of my questions, and I want to throw a question to you, Robert. I think what Mark is touching on is this interesting conundrum of government moves slowly when it comes to creating policy and creating change, which in many cases is probably a good thing because it needs so much public input. At the same time, our democracy needs to keep evolving so it can meet the needs of its citizens. So for you, I guess I'm asking you this in part because of your experience as a teacher. How can we have these conversations better? Like, what can we do to move forward some of these issues as soon as they arise in a more efficient way?
In many respects, Olga, that's the $64,000 question, particularly appropriate for this time, which is how does the country learn or relearn how to engage in dialogue? And how can we have a difference of agreement with someone without there being our mortal enemy? And certainly we see that in the law enforcement community dialogue that's going on. And so I commend Sheriff Anderson and other law enforcement in Vermont for making the overture to communities to engage in that dialogue. I do have to say, with my law professor and Center for Justice Reform hat and restorative justice hat on, I do see some of the dialogue practices that exist within the restorative justice world as being valuable tools in getting communities to start to talk to each other. I created this PowerPoint that I tried to get some of our federal delegation and others to bite on for a national dialogue project. To just make it a priority in this country to figure out how to talk to each other. Because I am generally an optimistic person, but the polarization that we are seeing right now is really testing that optimism. And one thing that I think maybe the public doesn't always appreciate is how fragile our democracy is. And we're one little step away from a US Supreme Court decision or a state Supreme Court decision getting ignored by an executive, by law enforcement, by anyone. And this whole great experiment could be very much in jeopardy. So I know I'm not directly answering your question. It is the $64,000 question. How the heck do we learn to start talking to each other again?
Thank you. It makes me feel better that it's a tough question in a sense, because it means it's worth answering. For you, Mark, in your work, can you recall any moments where perhaps there was a tough conversation, and how did you address it?
We're dealing with tough conversations all the time. I mean, we can talk about tough conversations about hiring personnel, about people who've done inappropriate things. We have tough conversations about what do we do about the opioid problem. I mean, so there's not a tough problem that we're dealing with. We're dealing with many, and they're all overlapping, and some of them are intertwined, and some of them are so complex. I mean, I'm not the smartest guy in the room, and at the end of the day, I can provide input, but some of these are just even beyond the resources and abilities that we have individually or even collectively in our small state. I think it's important, though, that while we don't necessarily know the answer, that we do take action. I might not know how to talk to people, but I can start talking to people. And we might have some bumps along the way, but those are bumps that we learn from. Failures aren't the bad thing here. That's what we learn from. Those are the lessons to learn. And so from that, we can get progress. If we keep doing the same thing we have always done, or if we continue with what we know doesn't work, that's where we're going to fall on our faces.
Mm-hmm. So for folks who are out there thinking, yeah, democracy is hard, and I either A, don't want to run for public office, or I don't even want to go to my select board meetings, what do you love most about what you do? And can you share any stories about moments where you're like, yeah, this is worth it?
I do want to say it is a universal trait that people like to Monday morning quarterback, to use a sports phrase, which I don't usually do. It's a whole other thing when you have to make that decision. And so one of the exercises I do with my students is I give them a problem, a scenario, and they think we're going to talk about it collectively, about what the outcomes should be. It's a crime. And then I put each one of them in the role of judge, and they have to make the decision. And they say, my heart started pounding when I had to be the decision maker. And so what Mark is doing and what I did as state's attorney, not so much as high bailiff, almost every decision had a profound impact on people's lives. And that's an awesome responsibility that can be rewarding, that you can definitely screw up, and you try to learn from that. But I think orchestrating an outcome that achieves public safety while making the harmed party feel heard and making them feel like they had a real say in the outcome, that's very satisfying.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Mark?
So Robert just nailed it on the head. I didn't realize when I was second in command, I didn't realize just how hard it was to be the decision maker. I had all the answers and I knew everything, and I'm pretty sure I was in my early 20s, even though that's not true. It's just, it was easy to roll with, this is what we're going to do. This is how it should go, because there was that invisible force pushing back saying, nope, we're not doing that. And that invisible force is called your boss. And when you have that same inertia, momentum coming at you when you are in the seat, and you're the one saying, is this the right way? That was a learning opportunity for me that I continue to grow from. So what do I enjoy most about my job? I have a front row seat, not as sheriff, but as a law enforcement officer, I have a front row seat to everything. I mean, it's good and bad. It's baffling just how much you could see of the world. And so with that, it also means you get to be a problem solver. And I love solving problems. As sheriff, what I love the most about my job and what I loved before becoming sheriff was making things. It could be a system. It could be a procedure. It could be a strategy. It could be a tactical plan. I mean, whatever those things are. It could be a spreadsheet to say, how are we doing on stopping cars? But I loved making things. And as sheriff, I don't make tangible things anymore. I struggled with that in my first year as sheriff because I wasn't doing something I was passionate about in the form of making tangible things. And I realized I'm not making things. I'm creating vision. I'm creating a path that I need other people to follow for the betterment of the people in my community. And so with that, that's where I got to start embracing members of the community and say, how do we do this? I don't have the answer. I just met with 2 trustees from the library and like, hey, we're talking about this. It's like, I've been talking about that. Let's talk about this together. 2 separate rooms of 2 polar opposite worlds where we're now connecting and saying, how do we solve this identified problem? And that is, how do we build community? So we have the opportunity to do really cool, positive things where we can have people see a sheriff or a deputy sheriff or a police officer not in this light that we're currently seeing on national television or even regional or local television or the internet on Facebook, but rather to say, hey, I actually know, I know Robert and I talked to him before. And while what I saw on TV is bad, I know I can talk to him. I know Olga, I know I can talk to her. Let's look at this and see the totality of what's occurred. So I really enjoy having the ability to be a part of those conversations.
Thank you. Robert, anything float to the surface that you wanted to add?
Mark is spot on.
Thank you. So what do you think Vermonters need to better understand about the civics process as a whole so that they can engage with their democracy from a place of, I know this word is overused, but I'm going to use it, a place of empowerment, rather than from a place of, well, this is something that happens to me?
I'll shoot first.
Go for it.
I think this isn't the full answer, but I think it's a start. There's 2 pieces that we need to examine. Piece number 1 is our education system. We have a tremendous education system, but at least speaking from experience in my education here in Vermont, I grew up here in Vermont, born and raised and stayed. I didn't come out knowing really what the sheriff even was. I got that from the Career Center because it was the sheriff's department teaching it. And so with that, I don't think we do our local, county and state government enough justice to explain the civics. This is how you engage. And the same dynamic, we need that education model for people who aren't in school, whether they're through forums at the library or other forms of educational centers. The second thing is that I think that part of the struggle, select board meetings are a good example. They're often underattended. Town meetings, often underattended. I think that a lot of the power that people used to enjoy a century ago was that's been eroded, and for a variety of reasons. But once you reach that downhill side of it's not worth my time to go to that meeting because of X, Y, or Z. Or maybe, and this is the more common answer I hear, it's not worth my time to deal with the stress of the confrontation at those political events. That's where we lose people, and we lose conversation and dialogue, and we lose empowerment of the the local populace. So I would like to see more control returned to local government. I'd like to see us consider ways that we can structure around asset sharing, regionalization, and try and build out the empowerment that people would say it's actually worth my time and willpower to do that.
Thank you. How about you, Robert?
We all had ancestors who sat around a fire and figured out how to resolve dispute, because if they didn't do that, they wouldn't survive.
Mm-hmm.
And we've evolved or devolved into a system where we outsource our response to problems. So some incident happens in a remote corner of Windsor County or Windham County, and the case gets sent to Brattleboro or White River, and it gets handled by people who maybe don't know the community or the people involved. We've kind of sanitized it because we don't have to deal with it. And so I would like us all to, myself included, reappreciate that we have an obligation to make our communities the way we want them to be. We can't just outsource the response. Related to that, one of the really extraordinary things about Vermont is everybody knows everybody. And if you don't know that person, you're 1 degree of separation. So my students will say, boy, I wish I could talk to the governor or senator. And I said, okay, let me arrange that. You know, and so people need to know that if they have something that they want to say and be heard, it is not hard to deliver that message to people who are in a position to affect change.
And for anyone who is considering seeking public office, what is your advice for them?
Do it.
Why?
Well, first of all, I do think it is rewarding representing the people. There are some public service jobs that I think might drive me I'm not sure I would like so much. There are others that are more interesting, but you can't just complain from the sidelines. You gotta kind of, if you care about change, you gotta get in the mix, and running for office gets you in the mix.
And what would you suggest people could do to maybe prepare? Because I think running for office is intimidating to a lot of people. So do you have any advice on how to get over that kind of fear?
Yeah, and it's hard. The offices that I've run for have such a discrete area of focus, which also means you can do it with a discrete knowledge base, which is good for me because I know a lot about a few things and almost nothing about a lot of things. I've often thought that running for the legislature would be the best adult continuing education course that there is. There are programs in Vermont that are specifically geared toward training people to run for office, whether that's the Snelling Center or Vital Communities in White River Junction, Emerge that trains women to run for office. So if someone wants to learn the ropes before they actually run, those are certainly some ways. Last comment, picking up on something that the sheriff said, is start going to meetings. Start listening to the dialogue, start talking at town meeting or select board meetings, and just start getting engaged in that fashion.
Thank you. How about you, Mark? What's your advice to folks who might consider running for office?
In addition to do it, because that was the easy answer. He took the easy one. It's be willing to have an open mind. The hard thing about running for office, so as sheriff, I have a bit of a contention because I believe that my job and my profession should be apolitical. Again, we are there to be fact finders in a law enforcement capacity. We are there to serve very discrete functions. It's funny, you can talk to families and it's like there's 3 topics you don't talk about at Thanksgiving: politics, religion, and I forget the third one, but I'm sure someone can fill it in. And at the end of the day, it's similar in policing, that if I start saying I believe in this set of values, I've automatically alienated this set of values. We don't need that. The other thing, going back to being open-minded, is that just because I believe in this set of values doesn't mean that I can't learn from this set of values. And so I've had the benefit of talking with people on both sides of the aisle, and regardless of party politics, saying we may even agree to disagree, even if we acknowledge the same problem. But can we find a way to work together? Can we find a way or commonalities of our problem that both of our solutions could work? How can we tailor that? So having an open mind allows you to have those discussions and be effective.
Thank you. Anything else you want to add before we sign off today?
I would just say, Mark, you've just given me a great idea, which is a common ground project. It would be really interesting to structure something where 2 people who have wildly divergent views. It's almost, you could make it almost a game. They have to come together and find common ground. And they can't win unless and until they find common ground. You've given me a good project while I'm waiting for something to do as High Bailiff.
I love it. I love it. Well, and what's so crucial about that for both of you is, as everyone knows, Vermont is so small that there's really not enough of us to be rowing the boat in our own direction. We kind of need to be pulling the oars in the same direction if we're going to get anywhere. Mark, Robert, it was such a pleasure speaking with you today. I'm really glad you could join us here on Civic Yarn. And to everyone who tuned in, thank you, and stay tuned. We will have another show coming right up. Take care, everybody.